All right. Next talk in the Terrified Chipmunk track, the 12:30. We've got Jamie here. He's gonna talk to us about getting started in OSINT. Super interesting topic. Excited to hear about it. If you've got questions, please post those in the Terrified Chipmunk track, and I will go ahead and ask them to Jamie. All right, sir, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Hopefully you guys are all doing well today. So like Jason had said, the title of this talk is Getting Started with OSINT. That's an acronym for Open Source Intelligence. This is sometimes called Reconnaissance. This is sometimes called information gathering. I see those terms used interchangeably a lot, but really what we kind of mean by that is information gathering, right? In this case, we're trying to learn as much as we can about a target organization. Let's see here. So before we get into that, really quickly about myself, I work for a company based here in North Dakota. That's where I'm streaming from. Based here in Fargo called High Point Networks. I spend about 90% of my time specifically on penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. And that's going to be kind of from where I'm speaking to you guys from, or sort of the perspective of this presentation. Before that, I did a lot of different stuff. So I started out like a lot of people in IT. I started out right on the help desk, jockeying tickets and stuff like that. After that, I was a network administrator for a couple of years. And then my first probably real security job was a vulnerability management role where I was kind of managing scanners. So I really enjoyed Megan's talk earlier where she had talked about a lot of the things that makes kind of scanning pretty difficult. So a really high level overview of our agenda today. We'll kind of discuss OSINT. We'll talk about tools and techniques and kind of define it. And we'll take a break. We'll see a couple examples. We'll take a break from the slides, see a couple of examples, and then we'll kind of bring it all together with Recon-ng. So yesterday morning, if you saw John Strand's keynote, the very first tool he mentioned, right, was Recon-ng, and that's for good reason. Recon-ng is a really nice framework for bringing information together from all these different places. So we can take data from APIs over here. We can take information from sites we scraped over here and bring that all together in one spot. And that's really useful. So we'll be taking a look at that. I wanted to put a really quick slide in here to kind of set expectations, I guess. So OSINT and information gathering and reconnaissance is a really wide topic. And we only have about 50 minutes here today. So there's no way that we can cover everything. So everything we're going to talk about for our talk today is going to be considered passive information gathering. And what I mean by that is all of our examples are going to be using publicly available data, right? We are going to be hands-off on our target environment. The reason that I think gathering information this way is really useful is because from a pen tester's perspective, if you're a penetration tester, you have to have explicit permission before you touch your target environment, right? So we have what we call our ethical hacking agreement, and that's a legal document that we have our customers sign before we even run a port scan. Sometimes our customer's legal team wants to review that document. Sometimes they want amendments made, and that's great. We love that. But sometimes that adds a couple days, right? Going back and forth between lawyers and things like that. And that can push your project out a couple days. But if that happens, because we are staying totally passive with our information gathering, that's stuff we can still do before we have that document signed. So for that reason, I like to consider this completely passive information gathering. The other point is that, again, this isn't meant to be a complete guide for information gathering, like I mentioned earlier. But this is more of, so when we'll have seen that we have collected some information, and we can take a look at that information and we can say, oh, we've discovered some interesting hosts, and they have some interesting ports open on them maybe. So when we begin testing, maybe we want to zoom in on that, or we want to focus on these hosts, and we'll research those hosts more. So again, this is really meant to be a getting started point. And then the last point, everything we're going to talk about today, I'm fairly certain has been covered somewhere else. So there's not necessarily going to be anything new, but a lot of this stuff I didn't see packaged all up into one place. So that's kind of what I wanted to try to do. I wanted to take all of these kind of tools and techniques and put them into one talk, and hopefully the audience can start to use those tools right away to gather information. So that's kind of our goal for today. So let's kind of talk really quickly about why information gathering is important. And on the right-hand side here, I have kind of a flow. This is like a high-level penetration testing methodology. And this is pretty standard. I'm sure a lot of testing firms use this. And information gathering is right at the top. That's where you should start a good pen test. But that might not be the most interesting place, right? I myself was pretty guilty of this. I used to be kind of only interested in exploitation and post-exploitation because that's where the really cool stuff is happening. That's where the exciting stuff is happening. So I used to just jump right into scanning, right? I would get a list of hosts and just start scanning immediately. And then I would maybe find something like an Outlook web app, for example, and think, oh, let's try to enumerate usernames from Outlook web app. Well, you need to know the username scheme. In that case, you need to know if usernames are first name dot last name or first initial last name or something else. So then I would have to go back and kind of gather that information. So really, it's much more efficient to go in order, right? To start with the information gathering, because the information you gather may change what you're scanning. That may dictate what you want to hone in on. And then my other point is project scope. So we were doing a penetration test for a customer, and I started kind of doing some reconnaissance, doing some information gathering, and I discovered another domain. And since this is all kind of passive information gathering, I just started looking for hosts on that domain, looking for open ports, things like that. And I had found a few more servers. I had found a lot more servers actually. And this was right when the Bluekeep vulnerability was getting a lot of attention. So there were a lot of Windows servers with RDP exposed. So I reached out to the customer and said, hey, are these your hosts? Should we include these in the testing? And they said, oh yeah, we need to include those in the scope. We forgot about those. And in the case of that pen test, our most critical findings actually came from those hosts that we added to the scope. So if I hadn't been very diligent with my information gathering, we would have missed findings in that pen test, and that customer would have had blind spots. So after kind of seeing that firsthand, I think it's really important to be diligent with your information gathering. So with that in mind, what kind of stuff, we've talked a lot about information gathering, what kind of stuff or what kind of information would we like to get if we wanted a starting point? So things I'd like to have right away, I'd like to have a list of names. If we have first and last names of employees, we can start to figure out email addresses, which might be nice if we want to send phishing emails, and we can start to figure out usernames. Potentially we can start to figure out usernames. If we know what the username scheme looks like, if it's something like first name dot last name, or if we have a list of names, we can just generate that. I'd like to know what hosts are out on the internet, and I'd like to know what ports they're listening on, and that can kind of give me a rough idea of the attack surface of those hosts. Now, again, I mentioned this is all going to be passive information gathering, right? So we're not going to be launching any scanners or using any type of scanning tools, but we can take advantage of services like Shodan or Binary Edge, which are kind of scanning services, and we can see if they have scan results for the hosts that we're interested in. Excuse me. And then lastly, compromised passwords. So if people inside the organization that we're doing a pen test for have passwords that are kind of floating around on the internet, the customer of that company would want to know about that. And as testers, we want to know about that too, right? Credential stuffing attacks are very real attacks. And if our goal as pen testers is to emulate a real world attack, then credential stuffing should be something that we're striving for as well. So where are we going to get all this stuff? The target's website is a good place to go. LinkedIn is another good place to go. I really like LinkedIn for figuring out who's who and putting names to faces. That's pretty useful. I've seen some people, they'll create like a kind of like a burner account, and then just make a bunch of connections that way using kind of a burner account or like a Puppet account. Generally, I don't do that often. I'm connected to a lot of salespeople, and salespeople really like LinkedIn. So for the most part, when we're doing a pen test for a customer, I usually already have like second and third connections into that company, so I can already kind of see most of the people. But we'll also use a Recon-ng module that doesn't require a LinkedIn account at all to gather names. So that's kind of nice. Job postings can reveal interesting information. We'll see a couple examples of that. Other search engines, I already mentioned Shodan. So Shodan, if you're not familiar, is a website you can go to and you can search publicly available scan results. So Shodan, actually as a company, they're scanning everything on the internet and then allowing us to look through those scan results. So that's really nice. We can also take advantage of information that's been indexed in Google, and we'll see an example of Google Dorks. Documents that are published publicly, such as PDFs or spreadsheets, sometimes they have metadata inside of them, and that can lead us to discover usernames. We'll see an example of that. And then lastly, data breaches, right? So again, kind of back to that idea, if passwords and credentials are out there, why not take advantage of those for the purposes of our testing? So as a couple examples, so we'll kind of see examples, or we'll kind of go through examples of each one of these now. So here's something, I don't see it too often, but just a screenshot of a website here that I had put together for Colonel here. So sometimes, mostly on smaller businesses, if you go out to their website, they might have a page where it'll say something like meet our team. And then here you're going to have first and last names and pictures of everyone. So that makes it pretty easy to just go to the customer's website and figure out everyone's name. And then from there, we can potentially figure out email addresses. Other things that are cool to do, there's actually a browser extension called Email Extractor. And as you're browsing to websites, that will just grab email addresses for you. And then you can export those out. So again, if we were thinking we wanted to do something like a phishing email campaign, we can gather up a lot of email addresses pretty quickly this way. So here's a job posting that I had saw. This is for a IT technician in town here at Fargo, and they mentioned a couple interesting things. So kind of under the first arrow here, they mentioned specifically FortiGate firewalls, and they used the term at each of the campus locations. So that kind of tells us two things, right? That tells us A, they're using Fortinet firewalls, but also B, there's multiple office locations. So if this was a company that we maybe wanted to scope a pen test for, that'd be something I would ask. Are we going to be testing just the main site, or are there other offices we should focus in on? Are the security controls, are the physical security controls the same across all of those offices? Those are things we would want to know when we're testing. The other thing that I thought was pretty cool is they mentioned they're using Landsweeper here, and Landsweeper is a network scanning tool. So they're doing, this kind of implies to me that they're doing some scanning in their network, or at least some asset discovery. And again, as a tester, this is, if we were going to even scope a pen test for this company, that would be stuff I would like to ask. So I would say, hey, we can see that you guys are using Landsweeper. how frequently are those scans occurring? If I just walk in off the street and plug my laptop into a conference room, is Landsweeper going to discover that? And if Landsweeper does discover it, then what happens? Is someone going to come chase me down? So that would all be, part of a cool test that we could run. So in some cases, I like to even take a look at some of this stuff even before we meet with the customer for the first time, because if you know some of this stuff ahead of time, that can lead you to asking some of these questions that will help you scope a really valuable pen test for that customer. Here's just one more example. Again, another company in Fargo here, and kind of at the arrow here, they mentioned specifically that they're using Cylance. And so that's kind of nice to know. Again, knowing what type of security product is on the endpoint is pretty nice to know that up front. Now, again, if you were thinking you wanted to do phishing emails or something like that, knowing which AV you're going to need to work around is going to kind of be advantageous for you. So some tools that'll kind of make this stuff easier. We'll talk through these really quickly. theHarvester is a really simple and easy to use Python script. This is written by a guy, he goes by Laramies out on GitHub, and I have a link here to his code. But essentially, we can download this script here. We point it at a domain, we tell it what data sources to look through, and it'll just grab information for us. So this is, theHarvester is looking mostly through search engines. So we can point it at search engines like Google, Yahoo, and DuckDuckGo, and it's going to grab email addresses that are indexed and websites or hosts out on the internet. So very simple to use. We'll see a quick example of that. Document metadata and Google Dorks. I kind of put two things on the same slide here. So if we discover documents like PDFs or Word documents or something, we can download those and analyze the metadata, and that could lead us to discover who created the document and what piece of software they used to create the document. So an easy way to kind of discover documents like that would be to use what are called Google Dorks. And Google Dorks are really just kind of like a search filter inside of Google to make your searches more accurate. So what a really basic Google Dork would look like here would start with the word site and then colon and the domain that you want to search specifically on. And then if we wanted to, if we wanted to search for a specific file type, we could use the file type filter, and we could say, show me all of the PDFs. And that'll show us all of the PDFs on web pages that Google has indexed. Then we can download those and look at the metadata inside of them. Foca is another tool that kind of automates that entire process. So we'll see an example of that. So Foca does a really good job of searching the internet for those documents, downloading them, and extracting all of the good data right out of them. I felt like I wouldn't really be doing you guys justice if we didn't at least mention Foca. So if you're targeting a large organization, or just an organization that has a lot of documents shared publicly for whatever reason, like think hundreds of PDFs, Word documents, Foca does a really nice job of kind of going through that stuff automatically. And then lastly, data breaches, right? So I kind of mentioned this, attackers use compromised credentials for credential stuffing attacks. So as pen testers, that's an attack that we would want to replicate as well. Getting a hold of data breaches is definitely kind of in a gray area. So that's something you're going to want to be careful with. Anytime you gather a set of credentials and try to use those to access a site or service, you absolutely have to have explicit permission. So one such example of a data breach would be what's called the Breach Compilation, and we'll take a look at that. It's like a 40 gig kind of database of credentials, essentially. If you follow the GitHub link here, you might find a magnet link that would allow you to download that. If you do download that, neither myself nor Colonel Khan or High Point or anyone is willing to accept any responsibility for you taking the passwords inside of that database and compromising someone's account that you don't have permission for. But I think that kind of goes without saying. Even if you don't necessarily want to gather up a bunch of data breaches, you can take advantage of Have I Been Pwned service. They have an API you can use inside Recon-ng. It does cost about $3 a month to get the key. And essentially what you can do is you can check email addresses against the Have I Been Pwned database. Now, the only bummer about that is the Have I Been Pwned service will tell you if the email address is in a data breach, and it will tell you which data breaches the email address has been in, but it won't actually give you the password. So in that case, that's kind of a bummer, but I still think there's value in getting running a list of users through there and seeing who's been exposed in which data breach. That can kind of give you an idea of the external exposure or the external risk. And having that information can lead you to have really good conversation with managers, right? So you can say, hey, did you know that so-and-so in finance, they've had their password exposed in 9 different data breaches. Have we talked to that person about password reuse? Have we talked to them? Have we given them security awareness training? If you have this kind of information, I think it helps you kind of have those conversations with people. So let's kind of take a quick break from the slides here and see kind of some examples of some of this stuff. Looks like we're doing okay on time. Let's see. Yeah. So hopefully you can, I switched out of the slides. Hopefully everyone can see this. So again, I forgot to mention earlier, I had a picture of my dog, Frank, up on one of the introductory slides. I forgot to mention, Frank's also a business dog. He runs a little e-commerce company here with all of his friends, and he's given us at KernelCon kind of permission to test his site and test his company. So if we were going to do that, if we were going to do some OSINT on Bones for You here as his company, we can start with his website here, and we can see on his website right here, they kind of have a teams page where they have first and last names of all of their team members. So if we wanted to generate a list of that quick, we could just download a copy of this web page. So I'm going to kind of copy his URL here. And then over on this window, this is just an Ubuntu Linux server that I'm SSH'd into. It just happens to sit somewhere else. So this is kind of the work from home setup. But anyway, on the Linux machine here, I can just download a copy of that web page, and we can try to parse out those names. So what I'd be looking for is I'd kind of be interested in knowing how these names are formatted inside the HTML. So if I inspect the element here, we can kind of see, it's probably actually pretty small in the stream, but inside here, you can see that the names are inside of a heading 3 HTML tag. So we could use something like grep, and I could just grep on that tag inside the file, and that'll get us pretty close to the names. If we wanted to take that a step further, I kind of have a really ugly bash one-liner here where I'm just I keep piping the same thing into sed. The first time I'm going to strip out all the white space. The second time I'm going to remove the first heading 3 tag, and then the last time I'm going to remove the last heading 3 tag. And if we run that, now we see we have a really nice list of names. And so my point with that is, if that stuff is out there on a website, it's really easy to get, right? So we haven't even used anything really, we haven't really used anything too crazy, right? This is all just kind of Linux command line stuff. And there's probably a better way to do that, right? I just keep using sed because that's what I know. But again, if that stuff is out there, that's going to be really easy for us to get. So let's see. One of our other examples was Google Dorks and looking for documents. So again, if we want to search on a specific site, I'll just use the site filter here, and I'll say bonesforyou.com. And if we search that through Google, we'll see everything that Google has indexed about this particular site. So if we just want to find PDFs, then we can use the file type filter. And I can say, show me all of the PDFs that Google knows about or that Google has indexed. And in this case here, we see a couple PDFs. It looks like in this case, they have a PDF of their privacy policy. So maybe we can analyze this document. In this case, I'm going to be using EXIF tool, which is kind of a command line Linux tool. And you can see I'm kind of browsing from a Windows VM here. So if you were kind of browsing from your Linux machine, downloading this, would be as easy as downloading it from the browser. In my case, I'm going to come over here and use wget again and give it that URL. And you can see wget is kind of considering this an HTML file, but it still gathers the PDF. So if we use EXIF tool on that file, here we can see all of the document metadata that's embedded inside of that PDF. And it gives us a couple of interesting things. It'll tell us what piece of software was used to generate that. So in this case, we can see that these guys use Office 365. That might be kind of nice to know. That's probably where their email lives. And we can also see the username of the individual that created this particular PDF. And the reason I like to look inside these documents is that sometimes I've seen companies do something like this where they'll use something other than like first name dot last name for username schemes, or something other than first initial last name. And kind of the issue with that, right, is if that's how you're formatting your usernames, that's pretty easy to guess, right? If I know someone's name, well, then I know their username as well. So I've seen organizations do things like assign an ID number. So usernames will be like ID and then a 4 or 5 digit number. I've seen first names and then employee numbers, stuff like that. In that case, that's harder to guess. But if we can discover usernames in documents, inside of documents like this, we might be able to kind of find a pattern and then produce a list of potential usernames. So that's kind of why I like to look inside these. Let's see. Looks like I gotta find. I wanted to use FOCA as an example here, but there it is. So I'll just kind of show you guys FOCA really quick. I apologize about that. I thought I had it pinned to the taskbar here. So anyway, FOCA is a really nice tool for kind of automating that whole process. So if we open up FOCA here, we can start a new project by clicking on the project button and then go new project. I'll assign this project a name. We'll just call it Bones, for example. And we'll give FOCA a domain website to look through. So with those two pieces of information, I can hit create. Hopefully, FOCA will then create a new project for me. And right in this window here, FOCA will automatically search for documents. So we can specify extension type, or we can just say all, search for all extensions, and we can specify our search engines. I'm just going to select Google here, and we'll click search, and we'll give it a second. And we can see that FOCA found our two PDFs here. So with these inside FOCA, what we can do is we can right click and say download all. FOCA will download those for us. And then we can right click again and say extract all metadata. And you can see FOCA populated all of this information over here on the left side. So if we click users, now we can see we've got these usernames here. And in here, we can just export that out to a file. And now I've got a list of potential usernames. So I like to use both of these methods, right? Again, the Google Dorks and the EXIF tool is really nice if you just want to spot check a couple documents. Like if you have less than 10 documents you want to look through, that works fine. But sometimes you'll find hundreds of documents that you need to look through. And if that's the case, FOCA does a really nice job of just going through all of that stuff automatically. So that's kind of why I like that one. Another tool to make our lives easy, again, would be the Harvester. So we kind of talked about that one a little bit earlier. Again, the Harvester is pretty straightforward to run. It's just a Python script. So we'll call it by name, and then we'll specify a domain to point it at, which in our case is going to be bonesforyou.com. We'll give the Harvester some data sources to look at, which would be Google, Yahoo. Yeah, that should be good. We'll just say Google and Yahoo for now. And then we'll give it a file type here. And, we'll give it a file name. So I'm just going to call it bones test, for example. And when we run this, the Harvester is actually going to generate two different types of reports for us. It's going to create a HTML report and an XML file. I also switched I wanted to make this easier to read, so I switched the color to black text on white background. So this yellow got really washed out, but that would be kind of the Harvester's banner right there. Some ASCII art for the program. So I apologize about that. But so you can kind of see here the Harvester is just sort of working its way through the results. So oops, we'll just give it a minute. So the Harvester's done. It's kind of found some information for us here, and it's kicked that out to the screen, but it's also written those to our file, our bones.test file. So we can see it found a couple of email addresses for us here, and it identified one of our hosts here. So if we look in the folder, the Harvester has created our two bones test documents, an XML file, and this one's actually an HTML file, but it doesn't seem to give it the extension for some reason. So I'm going to get a little ahead of myself here. I have a Python script that will parse out the email addresses and the hosts from the XML file here. And when we get to our Recon-ng section, we'll see how we can import the information we have here into Recon-ng. So if I just look at our emails here, those are the emails that we're going to want to import into Recon-ng. So I'm just going to copy those over now. And then when we get to Recon-ng, we'll focus on that. So hopefully you can kind of see here, again, the Harvester, very simple. We point it at a domain and we can get stuff from it. So that's very easy to run. And then let's see, the last thing we were going to look at here was a data breach, which in our case is going to be the breach compilation. So again, this thing's floating around on the internet. This is essentially just a collection of passwords that have been breached from other data breaches and sort of aggregated into this massive compilation, I guess. All of the information inside of this thing is kind of broken down by the first character in the email address. So for example, if we go into the C directory here, we can see the text file is all the characters here is the next character in the email address. So if we look at the first 10 lines of like the C file here, you can kind of see that that's kind of literally the contents of each one of these files is an email address and then the password inside of it. And that's basically what this thing is in its entirety. It's like 40 gigs of this data. So if we have something like this and we wanted to search through it, in the download, they include a really nice little query script here. So if we wanted to query this, we can provide it an email address. And if we run that, it will search through and return us all of those, any records that it finds. So in our case, these are potentially passwords that Frank could be using on other systems. So if we wanted to make use of these, I'll just we'll run that command again and then just output it to a file called Frank's passwords. And now we have those saved in a nice text document. So I'll just go ahead and copy that over into our Recon-ng folder again. And that can be another piece of information that we can take out of this data breach and then import that into Recon-ng. And then again, the whole idea there will be we'll have all of our information in one nice spot. So again, kind of getting ahead of myself here now, we'll kind of switch back and focus back on the Recon-ng stuff for a little bit here. Again, kind of bringing all of this together with Recon-ng. So kind of as John mentioned yesterday morning, the whole point of Recon-ng is that this is sort of a framework for information gathering. This is a place where we can take information from all of these different sources and put it together in one spot. Recon-ng is made by a guy named Tim Tomes. In addition to running his training company, he maintains this on the side. So very, very nice program. One thing I wanted to cover quick, if you are, if you've used Recon-ng in the past, then you'll kind of know, I think sometime last summer, the whole program went through a pretty big update. And in that case, the functionality is still pretty much the same, but a lot of the commands have changed just a little bit. So if you're someone who was using Recon-ng 4 in the past, like I was, it was a little confusing at first. Brian King from Black Hills InfoSec, he is a really, really nice guide kind of summarizing all of the changes inside. And just as one example, with the meme here, in the past, if you wanted to add companies in Recon-ng on version 4, that command was simply add companies. In version 5, that command is now db insert companies, as we'll see. So there's just a lot of little command changes like that to be aware of. But if you've never used Recon-ng before, perfect time to start because you don't have to unlearn any old habits. So before we get into Recon-ng, we'll kind of, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to kind of talk about how it sort of organizes data. And you can kind of think of Recon-ng almost more like a database. So Recon-ng has this concept of tables, and tables is where it stores all of its information. So these are a couple tables here. These are the tables that we'll be looking at today, but these are not all of the tables that you can fill inside Recon-ng. I just think this is a good starting point. So for example, if we look at the contacts table in the middle, inside the contacts table, you have these different columns. So you have first name, middle name, last name, and email, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of all of the information that you can gather about a contact. One thing you'll notice that I find a little confusing when you're looking at it in this view, everything in these tables kind of looks like a row, but Recon-ng considers them a column. And when you export the data out of Recon-ng, they appear actually in columns. So that's why it considers each one of these, they look like rows, but they're really called columns. So that might catch you off guard a little bit. So to populate the information inside of those tables, Recon-ng makes use of modules. So all of these are modules that we'll take a look at today. Again, this is not a complete list of all of the modules inside Recon-ng. These are just modules that I use pretty frequently, and I think they make a pretty good starting point. Anything with an asterisk does require an API key. So a lot of getting data from a lot of these different sources, you do need to register with that service in most cases and get an API before you're allowed to query those services. So we'll take just a couple minutes here and talk through some of these modules that require API keys, and then we'll kind of run a quick Recon-ng exercise against our target domain so you guys can kind of see what that looks like. Oh, yeah, right. So before we do that, kind of breaking these modules down a little bit. In this way, it's kind of a lot to look at, right? So the first thing, or the first kind of item you see as you read these left to right, is kind of the module's type. And in this case, we can see that this is a Recon module. So it's going to be gathering information. Another type of module that we'll use will be an import module. And in that case, we're going to be importing our credentials that we found from the data breach. So the first piece, or the first thing to read here, is the type. The second keyword that you see here is the table that Recon-ng is going to read from. So in this case, this Bing module is going to be reading information from the company's table, and then it's going to be placing the information that it gathers inside the contacts table. So what that kind of looks like, if you think back to the table view, Recon-ng is going to be reading the company field out of the company's table, and then the information that it gathers from LinkedIn is going to populate the first name column and the last name column inside of the contacts table. And the reason I want to be really specific with this is this wasn't really, I had a hard time kind of wrapping my head around like this concept of tables and where all this information is going. And until I really started to kind of understand this, this is what made Recon-ng really useful for me. And when your modules don't work and you have to start kind of troubleshooting stuff, it's helpful to know where Recon-ng is trying to read from, where it's trying to write data to, and all that stuff. The other thing about the Bing search module, this is going to be querying Bing's cache for LinkedIn profiles. And what it's looking for specifically at the bottom here is the LinkedIn company name. So in our example here, our company name is going to be Bones for You, and we need that needs to match up with the company name that we give Recon-ng. So if we give Recon-ng something like Bones for You Inc. or Bones for You LLC, that's what it's going to be searching for through these cache LinkedIn pages. So if that doesn't match up completely, you might miss stuff. And I've had that happen to me before. So that's kind of why I make a point for that. You do need a Bing search API key. You can get one for free. You're just going to be limited on the amount of queries that you can run. The other module, or the other API that I like to query a lot, is the IP info DB, and this will allow you to get the geolocation of different IP addresses. And so again, this is kind of nice to know from the testing perspective. A lot of companies are moving to like software as a service type solutions, or a scenario where they use an application, or they host an application, but it's hosted somewhere else. It's living on someone else's servers. And from the tester's perspective, that's something you want to know about. That might change the scope of your test, especially in something like a web app pen test. You might be allowed to test the web application itself, but the underlying server, that might be hands off. You might not have permission to do a port scan. And so knowing where the servers are located physically, or knowing where the hosts are located, that can kind of clue you into some of that stuff. You can see, this is in a giant Microsoft data center. This is probably hosted in Azure. You can start to kind of think about those sort of things if you get an idea of where the hosts are. Shodan is another service we'll query. Again, Shodan kind of runs internet-wide scans and allows us to query those. So without even doing any of our port scans, we can get an idea of what ports are open. Again, you do need a premium account to access the API. They're usually on sale for like $5 on like Black Friday type things. I've seen that pretty frequently. But another nice thing for students, if you register for Shodan with the .edu address, you'll automatically get bumped up to a premium account. And then you can use Shodan's built-in API. So that's kind of nice. And then another service that we'll kind of make use of is called Binary Edge. Binary Edge is very similar to Shodan. They offer a very similar service where we can query their scan results. They do have a kind of free tier, but again, it's limited on how many queries a month that you can use. So kind of enough talking about it. Let's sort of see what it looks like when we run some of this stuff. So again, Recon-ng is going to be a Linux app, right? Well, not necessarily. It's a Python app, so wherever you choose to run Python. But I don't know how much luck you're going to have. Well, you might be able to use it on Windows. I don't know. I prefer to use it on Linux. So from my Recon-ng folder here, I will just start kind of the main Recon-ng program here inside Python. Again, Recon-ng kind of has like a menu-driven interface. So if you're kind of familiar with like Social Engineer Toolkit or something like Metasploit, this is going to be pretty similar here. So the first thing we see, we're kind of just dropped into a default workspace here. So Recon-ng has this concept of workspaces. So you can kind of keep projects separate. So if we wanted to create a workspace, we can use the command workspaces create, and then I'm just going to call our workspace bones for the sake of our test here. So Recon-ng's created this new workspace for us, and you can see that our prompt here, kind of at the bottom, has now changed. So we're put in the bones workspace here. So this is where we can start to do some work. So I mentioned we wanted to import some of that information that we already gathered. We have a list of email addresses, and we have a text file that contains some credentials. So that'd be stuff that we would kind of want to bring into Recon-ng here. So to do that, we'll use our import modules. So in Recon-ng, if you want to use a module, the kind of specification is modules load, and then the module name. And in this case, I'm going to use the import file module. Oops, maybe not. Import list module. So tab completion obviously is your friend there if you kind of forget. So again, you can see that the prompt here has changed again. So Recon-ng is telling me that I'm in the list module. And if I use the command info, Recon-ng is going to give me all of the information about this module. And this module is pretty straightforward, right? Imports values from a list and puts them into a database table and a column. So we need to tell Recon-ng what table do we want to put this in, what column do we want to put it in, and what's the file name, where are we going to get that file. If we forget what the tables look like, or we need to check, we can run the command db schema, and that's going to show us all of Recon-ng's tables and what they look like. And in our case, we have a list of email addresses. So this seems like a pretty good place for them, the contacts table and the email column. So let's set that. So we can say options set table contacts. And that's telling Recon-ng we want to put this information in the contacts table. We'll tell Recon-ng that we want to put this in the email column. If we clear that out and show our info again, we can see that those two options have been set. The last thing we need to set is the file name. And ahead of time, when we gathered those email addresses, I already put them in the Recon-ng folder. When you're running commands inside Recon-ng, if you put a exclamation in front of your command, that tells Recon-ng that this is a command that's meant for the operating system, right? So if I do like a exclamation ls, that's going to list all of the files that are inside Recon-ng's folders. And here I can see I have my emails.txt file. So that's the option that I'll set there. So I'll go options, set, file name, emails.txt. If I clear this, we can see we have all of this set. So if I run this, we can see that Recon-ng has imported this information and added those email addresses to our contacts. So now if I run show contacts, I can see that this table has those email addresses inside of them. Let's see. So I'm going to skip ahead here. We're running a little short on time here. So that would be basically the same process for importing any piece of information, whether those are credentials, whether those are hosts, whether those are email addresses. I know we have our credentials here, but I'm going to skip those for right now. So if we wanted to move ahead and try to gather more names, we could use our Bing module here. On this one, we can see that there's not really a whole lot to set here. The only thing with this module is by default, it has you're not limiting the number of API requests. I like to set this to a 1 just because I've seen this module kind of go crazy. You end up gathering like people's second and third connections, and you can end up way off target on this. So I like to set this to option set limit 1. And then if we run that, oops. Oh, right. One thing I had forgotten to give here is we have forgotten to supply Recon-ng with a company right now. And we've actually forgotten to give Recon-ng a domain as well. So a lot of these modules, in this case, when I tried to run this module, it said it doesn't have any input. Well, that's because it's looking for something inside of companies. And if we run our command show companies, we don't have any data. So if we want to add something in here, we can say db insert companies. And now Recon-ng will prompt us for the company name. So we'll just call it Bones for you. We'll leave out the description. And now if I run show companies, I have that information in the table. The other thing we should add in real quick is the domain, right? So we'll say db insert domain. Sorry, db insert domains. And now we'll need to supply Recon-ng with the domain we want to target, which is going to be bonesforyou.com. Script, we'll skip that description. And then if we do show domains, now we see we have that piece of information. So now we should be able to use our Bing module. So if we use modules load recon companies contacts Bing, my option is already set. So if we run this here, we can see that we've automatically identified some people on LinkedIn here. And now if I do a show contacts, we can see that Recon-ng has added those entries into our contacts table for us. So that's pretty nice. Other modules, we'd like to find some affected hosts for our target here. So we can use recon domains hosts, and we can use the brute force utility here. So in this case, let's see if we have time for this. Actually, this one takes a little bit of time, so I'm going to skip it. But essentially what Recon-ng is doing is it has a word list of host names, and it's going to take every word in this word list and append it to the domain and see if that domain name resolves against Google's DNS servers. It takes a little bit of time to get through that. So I'm going to try to hurry past it. But a different module we can use is the certificate transparency module. And this will allow us to look for host names that have been inside SSL certs. So if SSL certs have been published for this domain, potentially host names have been revealed. So that's a nice module. And I kind of thought I was going to find more hosts that way. So now if we run show hosts, we can see we have one host here. Let's actually try to run the root host really quick. If we try to run this, I'm hoping this shouldn't take too long, but I need to find a couple host names for our Shodan module so we can identify some open ports here. So you can see that Recon-ng is just creating this massive list here, and it's found a couple of hosts. So now if we run our show hosts, we have a few more interesting hosts inside of here with IP addresses. The next module that might be kind of interesting to load would be the Shodan module. And here you can see there's nothing really to configure. If you already have the API key set up, we can just run this. And if we run this, now we're searching against Shodan scan results for these hosts here. And that one's taking a second, but this shouldn't take too long. So now if we run show ports, we can see that we've discovered some open ports on our affected hosts. So that's probably where I'm going to cut this because I want to leave time for the next speaker and any questions. But at this point, if we run show contacts, we've discovered a few email addresses and names for folks. So from there, we can generate email addresses or usernames. If we look at our hosts table, we've identified a couple hosts here that might be interesting. And then if we look at our ports table, we've already discovered some open ports on those hosts. So if we wanted to kind of take a closer look at some of these, for example, 3389 is commonly RDP. Maybe we can brute force the FTP. Take a closer look at this environment we have yet. We're information that's already out. So at that point, that's probably where I'm and try to end this. I'm sorry that ran a little. Thanks everyone for attending with us. I would encourage you to try Recon-ng out for yourself. If you have if you're an IT person or a security person at your own company, you can try to use these tools. If not, or if you're a student, if you don't have a company you can target, the bonesforyou.com domain is out there. Those hosts are out there. Any of the tools that we use today, you can run against those. All of that stuff is hosted out in Azure. So I don't really care what happens to it, but that's what it's there for. So feel free to run this stuff against bonesforyou.com.
Thanks, Jamie. That was great. I know that I really appreciate when people do the risk of live demos. So I appreciate that as someone who likes to learn how the tools work. So thank you very much. I will say there were a handful of questions in Discord. I don't think we have time, unfortunately, to ask them now, but if you can jump in there and reach out to you and you can have discussions with them. So thank you very much. Thanks for being a part of KernelCon 2020.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll get ready for the next talk here in just a minute. Thanks.